He handed her divorce papers on their anniversary. She slid a sealed envelope across the table. The strange thing was that Callum looked relieved when he handed me the divorce papers. Not guilty. Not nervous. Relieved. As though he had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally found a place to set it down. The restaurant around us glittered with anniversary candles. Soft music. Crystal glasses. Couples celebrating love. And across from me sat the man who had just ended our marriage between the appetizer and the main course. 10 years. Reduced to a stack of papers and a signature line. I remember staring at the documents. Then, looking up at him. Waiting. Because surely there was more. An explanation. A reason. Some sign that this was hurting him too. Instead, he said he hoped we could handle this like adults. Like adults. After 10 years. I almost laughed. Instead, I reached into my handbag, pulled out a sealed envelope, and slid it across the table. The relief disappeared from his face immediately, because unlike the divorce papers, he had no idea what was inside. I had been waiting 6 months for this moment. 6 months of watching. 6 months of learning. 6 months of building something he would never see coming. And tonight Callum was finally going to find out exactly who he had been married to. If you have ever been underestimated by the one person who should have known better, this story is for you. Welcome to Aurora Cinema Fiction. Stay with us. I want to tell you who he was before I tell you what he did. Because that is the part that matters most. That is the part that made everything else possible. And that is the part that hurt the longest when it was over. I met Callum at a dinner party on a Thursday evening in October. I was not supposed to be there. My colleague had cancelled last minute and asked if I would take her place because the host was a client she did not want to disappoint. I almost said no. I was tired. I had worked late 3 nights in a row. I had a book waiting at home and a glass of wine already poured in my mind. I said yes because she asked, and I am the kind of person who says yes when people I care about ask. That decision changed the shape of my life entirely. He was standing near the window when I arrived. Not performing. Not working the room the way certain men do at certain parties. Just standing near the window with a glass of wine looking at the street below with the expression of someone who is genuinely content to be exactly where they are. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. We were introduced by the host. He shook my hand and said my name back to me the way you say a name when you are actually listening rather than waiting for your turn to speak. 3 hours later, the other guests had gone and we were still at the table talking about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. He walked me to the end of the street. He said he hoped we would see each other again. He said it the way people say things when they mean them rather than when they are filling silence. I thought about that walk for 3 days. He called on the 4th. That was Callum. The man who noticed things. Who remembered things. Who showed up when he said he would and stayed longer than expected. And made ordinary evenings feel like they had been specifically arranged for the two of you. In our 2nd year together, I was going through something difficult. A situation at work that was costing me sleep and confidence in equal measure. I did not ask him for help. I am not someone who asks easily. But he noticed. The way he always noticed. He did not try to fix it. He did not offer advice I had not requested. He simply rearranged 3 weeks of his own schedule so that he was home when I came home. So that there was dinner. So that there was someone sitting across from me who was genuinely interested in how the day had gone. So that I never had to walk into an empty room during a period when empty rooms felt like more than I could carry. I fell in love with him during those 3 weeks more than I had fallen in love with him in the year that came before them. That was the man I married. The man who noticed. The man who rearranged things without being asked. Our 3rd anniversary he planned a weekend away. A place I had mentioned once in passing 6 months earlier during a conversation about somewhere I had always wanted to go. He had written it down. Arranged everything. Told me nothing until we arrived. When we got there, and I realized where we were, I looked at him. He was watching me with the expression of someone who is exactly where they want to be. I believed it completely. I believe it still. In a way that makes what came next considerably more painful than simple betrayal. Because the worst version of this story is not that he never felt anything. It is that he felt enough to perform it convincingly for a decade. And chose ambition over it anyway. The story begins 6 months before the anniversary dinner. A Tuesday evening in November. Ordinary in every visible way. I had come home earlier than expected from a dinner that ended before dessert. The house was quiet when I entered, or almost quiet. Voices from Callum's study. His and another I recognized. His business partner Bastien. I had known Bastien for 10 years, had cooked for him at dinner parties, had listened to his stories about his children, had considered him someone adjacent to family. I was not trying to listen. I was simply standing in the hallway removing my coat, and then one sentence came through the closed door with the clarity of something that was not meant to be heard. The restrictions expire on the anniversary. I stopped moving. A pause. Then Bastien again. And you are certain she still doesn't know what the land is worth? I stood in the hallway, my coat half off, the cold air still on my skin, waiting for Callum to say something that would make the sentence mean something other than what it sounded like. He did not say that thing. He said, "She has never shown any interest in the inheritance. She trusts me completely." The door to the study was closed between us. 10 years of marriage were on the other side of it, and I was standing in the hallway understanding that the life I had believed in had just revealed its actual structure. I finished removing my coat. I hung it carefully. I walked upstairs, and I began to think. My grandfather had owned a piece of land in the eastern county, a wide stretch of unremarkable terrain that everyone in the family had always considered worthless. He had left it to me in his will, not to my parents, not to my cousins, to me. Because I was the one who used to walk it with him on Sunday afternoons when I was small. Because I was the one who had listened to him talk about the way the light hit the hills in winter. Because he had loved me in the way of someone who saw something in a child that the child did not yet see in herself. I had inherited the land 11 years ago, 3 months before I met Callum. The legal restrictions around it were standard for inherited land of that type. A holding period before full transfer rights activated. I had never thought much about it. It was land. Unremarkable land that my grandfather had loved. What I did not know was what had been discovered beneath it 2 years after his death. Rare earth deposits. The kind that made certain people in certain industries very quietly very interested. The kind that turned unremarkable land into something worth hundreds of millions. The kind that made a man with the right connections and the right information decide that marrying the woman who owned it was a very sensible long-term plan. I spent 3 days confirming everything before I allowed myself to feel it. Not because I doubted what I had heard. Because I needed facts before emotion. By the end of the 3rd day, I had the full shape. He had known about the land before our first date, before the dinner party. Before he stood near the window looking at the street below with the expression of a man content to be exactly where he was. He had known before all of it, and he had chosen to walk toward me anyway, not because he saw something in me that he wanted to spend his life beside, because he saw something beneath the ground I had inherited and decided that the most efficient path to it was through me. I sat with that for a very long time. I sat with the dinner party, the walk to the end of the street, the 3 weeks he rearranged his schedule so I would not come home to empty rooms. The 3rd anniversary. The expression on his face when we arrived. I sat with the question of whether any of it had been real, and I arrived at the answer that hurt the most. Some of it had been real. The problem with a man who is genuinely charming is that charm used with calculation is still charm. He had felt things. Enough to be convincing. Enough to make 10 years feel like a life, rather than a strategy. And then at some point the calculation had overtaken whatever was real, and he had kept going anyway. That was the thing I could not forgive. Not the plan. The decision to keep going after the plan had already cost him the truth of what we were. I sat with that longer than I sat with anything else. Then I made a decision. Not about the land. About everything else. Before I could build anything, I had to grieve something. That is not a part of the story that gets told often. The strategic part is easier to talk about. The grief is harder, because grief requires admitting how much you believed. And I had believed completely. I remembered the year we nearly lost each other. Not to another person. To distance and pressure, and 2 people pulling in directions that were slowly separating them without either of them fully acknowledging it. We had a conversation one night in the kitchen that lasted until 4 in the morning. Not an argument. Something more honest than an argument. Two people saying the things they had been carrying alone because they had not known how to say them together. He had said things that night that I had never forgotten. Not the beautiful things. The honest ones. The ones that cost him something. The ones that only come from a person who is genuinely trying. I had held on to that conversation for years as evidence of who he was. Evidence I was now having to reconsider. Not discard. Reconsider. Because even now I could not decide whether that night had been real or whether it had been another layer of the performance. A man who understood that a marriage requires periodic authenticity to remain believable. I sat with that question for a long time. I never fully answered it. What I understood was this. It did not change what I had heard through the study door. It did not change the geological survey photographs. It did not change the 10 years of careful positioning. Whatever was real between us had not been enough for him to stop, and that was the answer that mattered. I also remembered the year his mother was ill. I had taken 4 weeks from work without him asking, driven her to appointments, sat in waiting rooms, learned the names of her doctors and the schedules of her medications and the specific way she liked her tea in the afternoon. Not because he asked, because she needed someone, and I was there, and that is what you do. He had cried once during those weeks. In the car on the way home from a particularly difficult appointment. He had not cried in front of me before that, and he did not cry in front of me again after it. But in that car for about 4 minutes he had let me see something that I do not think he showed many people. I had held his hand while he drove and said nothing because nothing was what was needed. I had believed that moment was the truest thing I knew about him. Now I held it differently. Not with less care. With more complexity. Because a man who can feel that deeply and still do what he did is a more difficult thing to understand than a man who feels nothing. And understanding it was the work I had to do before I could move. Not for him, for myself. So that what I built in the 6 months that followed was built on clarity and not on rage. Rage makes mistakes. Clarity does not. I did not change my behavior. I did not give him any indication that anything had shifted. I simply watched, and learned, and built. The watching came first. I had spent 10 years seeing Callum through the warm lens of someone who loved him. That lens had softened certain things, explained away certain inconsistencies, found charitable interpretations for choices that perhaps did not deserve them. Without the lens, the picture was considerably clearer. The way he had quietly discouraged my interest in the land over the years. It's just land, nothing to manage there. Don't worry about it. The way every significant financial decision had been structured in ways I had not fully examined at the time. I documented everything. Not with anger. With the deliberate patience my grandfather had taught me when we walked across unremarkable terrain on Sunday afternoons. Pay attention to what is underfoot, he used to say. The ground tells you things if you are willing to slow down and listen. I listened. Then I moved to the building. The first thing I noticed was that Callum's 3 largest clients had come to him through me, through social relationships I had maintained, through trust I had built over 10 years of dinners and follow-up calls, and the genuine interest I took in people that Callum had always treated as a soft skill rather than a strategic one. Those clients trusted me, not him. I understood what that meant. I contacted a lawyer Callum did not know in a city 3 hours away, then a financial consultant. And over the following months I built holding entities with no visible connection to my name. Through those entities I began quietly acquiring the client relationships his business depended on. Not aggressively, simply by being what I had always been. Someone worth trusting. Most of them moved without hesitation. But there was one phone call in the 3rd month that I did not expect. A client I had known for 8 years. Someone who had attended our wedding. Who had sent flowers when my grandfather died. I made my case carefully. Then I waited. The silence on the other end of the line lasted longer than any silence I had prepared for. Long enough that I understood the next 30 seconds would determine whether everything I had built held together or collapsed before it was finished. Then he said, "Send me the terms." He moved, but I sat with that silence for a long time afterward, because it reminded me that nothing I was doing was guaranteed. And that patience without certainty was the hardest kind of patience to maintain. By the 5th month, Callum's company was failing in ways he could not explain. His biggest accounts had quietly shifted. His revenue had collapsed. At a shareholder meeting, he stood in front of people who had believed in him for years and had no explanation for why everything was moving in the wrong direction simultaneously. The explanation was sitting at home, quietly finishing what she had started. Then Bastien took a call from a long-standing client. The client said the reason they had moved was not price or service or competition. Honestly, the relationship was always with Neve. We just didn't realize it until she wasn't there anymore. Bastien went very quiet on that call. He spent the following weeks feeling the shape of what he had heard more clearly. The moment he finally pulled the registration documents on the holding entity, he sat at his desk for a long time without moving. Her name was on it. He sent a letter. Not to me. To his own lawyer. Because the implications of what he had participated in over 10 years had become considerably more complicated than a business arrangement. Then I transferred the land. Not to myself, not to a holding company, to a charitable foundation established in my grandfather's name, dedicated to funding education and healthcare in the rural communities near the land itself. Completely legal, completely irreversible, filed 4 days before our anniversary dinner. I chose the restaurant. I made the reservation. I bought a dress, and I waited. The relief on his face disappeared the moment he saw the envelope, because unlike the divorce papers, he had no idea what was inside. Neither do you yet. Subscribe and keep watching. He brought the papers in a leather folder. I noticed it when he arrived. He placed it on the seat beside him rather than on the table. An almost thoughtful touch, as though the location of the folder somehow softened what was inside it. We ordered drinks. We spoke about small things. The performed normalcy of two people maintaining a surface for entirely different reasons. He was managing the moment. I was observing him manage it. Then, between the appetizer and the main course, he placed the folder on the table, opened it, slid it toward me, and explained quietly and reasonably that he felt it was time for them to go their separate ways, that he hoped we could be adults about it, that he had tried to make the terms as fair as possible. I looked at the papers, then I looked at him. His expression was the expression of a man who had arrived at a destination he had been traveling toward for a very long time, settled, resolved, already somewhere else in his mind. I reached into my handbag. I placed the sealed envelope on the table, and I slid it across to him. His eyes went to it immediately. Something moved in his expression. Uncertainty. Open it, I said. He looked at me. Then, at the envelope, he opened it. The photograph came out first. Him meeting with a geological survey team 2 years before our wedding. A meeting he had never mentioned. A meeting that had taken place on my grandfather's land. He went very still. The timeline came next. 12 pages. Every conversation I had documented. Every financial structure I had traced. Every decision I had mapped back to its origin. A complete account of 10 years of calculated patience. He did not read all of it at the restaurant. He read enough. Then the land transfer document. Signed. Witnessed. Filed. The land and everything beneath it now belonging to a foundation that could not be touched by any divorce proceeding or legal claim. He stared at it for a long time. Then the 4th document. A single page. Showing the holding entity that had been quietly dismantling his company's client relationships for the past 4 months, with my name on it. He looked up. His expression had changed completely. Not the settled, resolved look of a man arriving at a destination. The expression of a man who has just understood that the destination no longer exists. That the prize he spent 10 years moving toward is gone. That the company he built using her connections is gone. That the woman sitting across from him was not the person he believed he had managed for a decade. She was the person who had spent 6 months managing him. You planned all of this, he said. Not a question. A realization arriving late. I looked at him directly. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. With the calm clarity of someone who had finished something they began 6 months ago. You spent 10 years waiting for the land, I said. I spent 6 months making sure you would never touch it. He looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Not the calculation. Something underneath the calculation. Something older than the plan. Was any of it real? He said. His voice was quiet. Not accusation. Genuine question. The last thing a man asks when everything else is gone. I looked at him. More than you should have wasted, I said. He had nothing after that. I picked up my wine glass. I finished it slowly. I stood. I put on my coat. I could forgive a man for falling out of love, I said. I could never forgive a man for pretending he was in it. And I walked out of the restaurant without looking back. His world contracted in ways he had not anticipated. Not because I destroyed it. I had simply removed myself from it. And it turned out that a significant portion of what had held it together had been me. The social connections I had built. The relationships I had maintained. The warmth that certain people had associated with his name that had in fact originated entirely from me. Without me, his name was simply a man with a collapsing company and a story people were beginning to hear. The story spread the way truth spreads. Without my involvement, person by person through the quiet channels of people who knew what had happened. Some things simply moved on their own once the envelope had been opened. Callum contested the land transfer legally. Every avenue was closed. My lawyers had 6 months to prepare. His had 8 months of damage to manage. He lost the land. He lost the company. He lost the decade of positioning he had used our marriage to construct. There was a moment 3 months after the dinner when I received a message from a number I did not recognize. It was Callum. New phone. 3 sentences. He said he had spent a long time thinking about the kitchen conversation. The one at 4 in the morning. He said he thought about it still. I read the message twice. Then I put my phone down and went back to what I was doing. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. With the particular piece of a woman who has already decided what she is building next and does not have room for what she is leaving behind. Some doors you close not because you hate what was behind them, but because you have finally understood that keeping them open is costing you the future. I did not write back. The foundation launched 3 months after the anniversary dinner. The first school funded by the endowment opened in the spring. A small building in a rural community 40 minutes from where my grandfather's land stretched across the hills. I attended the opening, stood at the back, watched children file into a building that existed because an old man had walked across unremarkable terrain on Sunday afternoons with his granddaughter and had believed that what he left her should mean something. The plaque beside the entrance read his name. Beneath it, in smaller letters, was a line I had chosen myself. The greatest inheritance is not what we keep. It is what we choose to give away. I stood at the back of that room and understood something I had not been able to reach in the months of documentation and legal transfers and careful preparation. My grandfather had known, not the details, but he had understood something about me that I had not yet understood about myself, that I would find a way to make the land mean what it was supposed to mean. Even if the path to that meaning was longer and more painful than either of us could have anticipated. He had left it to me not because it was valuable. He had left it to me because he believed I was the kind of person who would understand what to do with something when the time came. He had been right. It had just taken 10 years, and a sealed envelope, and a man's relief at finally setting something down for me to get there. The foundation continued to grow. Schools, clinics, scholarships, small practical things that changed the daily texture of daily lives. My grandfather's name on buildings he never saw, in communities he had walked through for 60 years, meaning something permanent and real in a way that a bank account never could have. 3 years after the anniversary dinner, a journalist asked me at a foundation event what I would say to people who believed that a woman who had given 10 years to a marriage had nothing left to build with afterward. I smiled. Give her 6 months, I said. I turned back to the ceremony. 4 years after the anniversary dinner, a profile piece was published about the foundation. The journalist mentioned my name 14 times. Callum's name appeared nowhere, not because anyone had hidden it, simply because he no longer had a place in the story. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs it today. Subscribe to Aurora Cinema Fiction. Leave a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. You might be surprised how many people felt exactly what you just felt. And remember, every story we tell is made with one purpose: to make you feel deeply and remind you that love in all its forms is always worth fighting for.